Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Nanovic flash panel of the year. We hope there will be many more crises to come, so we can have more flash panels and entertain you with our wisdom. The Greek crisis is indeed a crisis, and it isn't going away. What it makes it so fascinating is that it is multiple crises. It's a crisis for the Greek economy and for the Greek welfare system. It is a crisis for Southern Europe in different ways, for major Southern European countries like Spain and Italy. It's a crisis for Germany. For those of you who know about Germany, in the past, Germany was enjoying getting along when it was divided, not having to exercise too much of a leadership role, West Germany. And today, Germany has this the nasty predicament of finding itself in a leadership position, and Angela Merkel and others have been trying to figure out what that means. It is, of course, also a crisis for Europe, both in terms of the Eurozone, but also, I think more importantly, the concept of what Europe is, broadly speaking, what it has meant since the Second World War. And importantly, it's a crisis for the United States. And isn't it easy for Americans to think that that little country, those Greeks so far away, what happens there is not really our affair. And it turns out that that's not true. Today, to help to clarify these and many more questions, I'm delighted to have what is really a fantastic panel, a fantastic lineup. Some of you will have encountered Chris Waller before. Chris is a professor on leave from our Department of Economics. He serves in an august position that is called the Director of Research at the St. Louis Fed. As I just learned, this means that he gets to go hang out with important people in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and decide our government's economic policy. And Chris reminded me, I am one of those people. And indeed he is, and as the result of this joke, Chris has promised that if you stay through this panel and afterwards, that he is going to tell us exactly when the Fed is going to raise interest rates. And this will be useful for all of us, but you must keep it a secret. That's the Notre Dame secret, that's the only question. Secondly, I'm really delighted to welcome George Tsebelis to Notre Dame. George Tsebelis is a leading political scientist in this country. He's one of the real pioneers in the application of game theory to the study of politics and political systems. And he is going to be with us this year at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. And I want to mention, George has two terrific articles that he's recently written about Greece, one of which is out more or less now, I'm assuming in the ether, I don't see it in paper, in Foreign Affairs. And it's a terrific article, and I recommend it to all of you. And finally, we have Rüdiger Bachmann, who is a professor of economics here in the economics department, and he is an expert on economic uncertainty. So that's my introduction. Chris has asked for 4 hours and 15 minutes to speak. I have restricted him to the 15-minute part, and so you're on. No, Chris starts. Start here.
Start here. I'm going to take all of Rudy's material. That's the problem. So, just a little, I'll take a minute of background. About 3 or 4 years ago, when Greek debt crisis first erupted, Jim asked me to come talk about the topic at a Nanovic event in Chicago, and that sort of snowballed into me doing this talk many times about 4 years ago. And then, of course, when it flared up again this summer, I got all those calls back from all the people that, calls back from all the groups I talked to before saying, can you come back and fill us in? And Jim was one of them. So the situation we have is that the European Union, as many of you knew, has been a long project in Europe, which has been aimed at trying to create a cohesive economic and potentially political union in Europe. And one of the signature events of that happening was the creation of the euro. And to get into the Eurozone in the 90s, you had to meet a bunch of monetary criteria about exchange rates, about interest rates, inflation rates. And then in addition, they introduced the fiscal stability pact, which was a bunch of conditions on your debt to GDP ratio, your deficit to GDP ratio, and some other, I can't remember what the third one was. And to get into the euro, you had to meet all these criteria. So when it came time to select, Greece did not meet any of the criteria, zero, didn't even come close. So they were not admitted to the euro in the first round, but then, for reasons that are still a bit of a mystery to a lot of people, Greece was admitted into the euro the following year. Now, up until that time, once they were admitted into the euro, quite surprisingly, the Greeks were able to borrow in international capital markets at exactly the same interest rate as the Germans. The spread was zero. Greek debt looked just like German debt. Then in 2009, there was what we call a bit of a shock, which was the Greeks had reported their deficit to GDP, the deficit being their shortfall in tax revenues, was around 4% of GDP. If I have all my facts straight, the new government came in the fall of 2009, kind of looked at the books, did a more proper accounting, and said, no, it's not 4%, it's 15%, which is shocking, let's put it that way. Well, this kind of woke the financial markets up, that we have a problem in Greece, that maybe their ability to finance themselves, their ability to repay their debt, isn't what any of us thought in the early 2000s to mid-2000s. So there was a crisis. There was a default by the Greeks on their debt, which, if any of you have ever read the Reinhard Rogoff book, you'll find out that this is now the 7th time in roughly 180 years that Greeks have defaulted on their debt, so it's nothing new. The Greeks were given a bailout, but they were given a lot of terms that they had to impose on their economy. And it imposed, as Jim was mentioning, and I'll let Rudy talk about some of the data rather than me. This created severe hardship on the Greeks in terms of their economy. I'll just mention a couple things. Our unemployment rate went from about 5% to 25%. Their GDP collapsed about 25%. Their national income fell 25%. If you're not aware, that's the U.S. Great Depression. That's literally 25% unemployment, 25% drop in GDP. That's the U.S. Great Recession. So that just kind of gives you, for what the Greeks are dealing with on the economic front, that's their situation. They implemented a bunch of reforms, started doing better on tax collections, cutting spending, laying off a lot of the civil service workers, which is about 50%, if I remember correctly, about 50% of the labor force. And by the end of 2014, they had their deficit to GDP ratio just either slightly negative or slightly positive, meaning they had done a lot of hard work to bring it down from minus 15 to basically zero. All their interest rates, at one point, to borrow, the Greek government had to pay 45% interest. You think your credit card's bad? This is severe. Now, after the bailout and after the reforms, let me see if I have the thing. The yield spread dropped from 40% over the German rate, 40 to 45%, to just over 5 percentage points above. So there was a lot of hard work that the Greeks did in the intervening period, but by 2014, the austerity, the pain, the economic conditions, as I predicted 4 years ago, which was kind of funny, it's one of the only predictions I ever got right, was going to lead to social revolt. And effectively, from my view, that's essentially what the Greek elections generated at the early part of the year. And a party of anti-austerity, anti-European oppression, or whatever you want to call it, came to power and said, we're going to basically unravel all this. It didn't work at the end of the day. So they took a very hard line with the Europeans, the Germans in particular. As Jim pointed, in this 50-plus year, 60-plus year project of European Union, there was a very simple model. It was a French-German project, and everybody else just tailed along. It's very simple. The French made all the decisions, and the Germans paid for them. The French are not in a position to pay for really anything anymore, and the Germans are now saying, you know what, we're not just going to pay for stuff anymore. So in some sense, the Germans are in this position of being the economic powerhouse, the ones with the money, and now, for the first time, really since the Second World War, they're in the position of having to lead Europe, and France is playing, in some sense, a secondary role. So this is all very, as Jim mentioned, this is all very, very new for Europe. And Germans being Germans, I know Rudy very well. Actually, he thinks I'm a harder German than he is. The Germans put a very hard line on this kind of revolt by the Greeks, who, in one way you can think of it, was they're like, you need to give us a lot of money and cancel our debt, and we're going to spit in your face while we do it. Didn't go over too well with the Germans. So it was a lot of brinksmanship for a number of months. A deal was finally offered by the Europeans by the end of June, which was rejected. A lot of things have been taken off the table. Some pretty serious stuff was taken off the table that the Greeks did not have to do after the referendum that rejected that package. All that stuff came back on the table. So the Greeks ended up with a much, much worse, much severe package by rejecting. So they got to tell off the man, but the man said at the end of the day, you're going to do what I tell you. So, and that's the situation they're in. The politics I'll leave to sort of others since then, but the Greeks finally did pass approval of this package of reforms. They're severe. It's going to be very difficult. I think the promise of debt relief, which has not been offered yet by the Germans, I think they're holding it back until they see some progress, in which case you'll see again, once again, some relief, which is effectively a form of default. I'll stop there.
Sure.
What I'm going to tell you is the political situation revolving around the negotiations and what is happening right now, both in Greece and in Europe. And okay, then where is the So, since January of 2015, the Greek government was negotiating with the European Union, and it was holding a very firm position. The Prime Minister has said, we are going to tear the memorandums and we are going to teach the Europeans a different strategy which will develop Europe. And he, for 7 months, was claiming that he was negotiating with pride. And when the Europeans made him an offer, he said, I'm going to put it in a referendum. And the referendum was a non-active offer that the Europeans had submitted. So it was an unofficial document. It went for the referendum, including English text, saying, do you approve or not? I mean, do you approve? No, do you not approve? Do you reject this text with numbers and some of it in English? No or yes. So 62% of the Greek people said no. And the Prime Minister went back to the European Union and he said, do you see what I told you? This is an unacceptable offer. And as a result, the Europeans introduced all the things that were off the table, and so he accepted at the end of the day, once he realized that the alternative would be to go back to the drachma, which would mean a massive devaluation of all the monetary supply of Greece, and while the debt would be still denominated in euros. So he understood that there was a major disaster coming. He closed the banks, which was also a very negative thing that the Greek people had to suffer and still are suffering. And so he said, okay, I am making a proud decision to avoid the collapse of the Greek economy, and I am accepting these terms. However, I want to tell you I don't like it. Okay? His party, who was trained to say no to anything that the European Union had said, was about to break down. And here is the situation of the Greek political system. There is the Golden Dawn, which is a fascist party, killing immigrants, etc. And Anexartiti Ellinas, which means independent Greeks, that is a very right-wing party, which was, along with Syriza, the government of Greece. Then there are three pro-European parties: New Democracy, the biggest of the three; PASOK, which used to be the government for something like 20 years after the Second World War; and Potami, which is a new party trying to show some kind of region within the Greek political system. Then Syriza, who is a left-wing party, and the left-wing platform were to the left, and they are splitting in terms of whether they want the drachma or the euro. And at the end is the Communist Party, which is against the euro and very much left-wing. Now, because of this split, what I'm going to tell you is that Syriza is the center of the Greek political system. That is, there is nothing that can happen in Greece without the approval of Syriza. And what he did is, he has three major options. One is to just eliminate the people from the left-wing platform and continue to be a minority government, or he can enter into a major coalition with all the pro-European parties. Instead of doing either of the two, he proclaims a new election because he says, I want to regulate the things inside my party. And I want to win against the left-wing platform, and then we will see what I'm going to do. And what he is planning to do is, he says, I am not going to enter into coalition with any one of these people. Okay? Now, let me tell you what is likely to happen in Greece in this 1 month before the election, until September 20. And then I will tell you what we can see from these negotiations in terms also of the European Union and how things can improve in the future, both for Greece and for the European Union. So what he says is the following. I am going to be a government without any necessary partner. I'm going to have a majority. Now, how is that possible? It is theoretically possible because there is an electoral system that is a proportional representation system, but gives 50 seats bonus to the biggest party. So the major question about the Greek elections is who is going to be the biggest party. And right now, all the polls indicate that the highest probability is that Syriza will be the biggest party. Then there is a second part in the Greek electoral system that there is a 3% threshold. So a party that gets 3.1% gets 3% of the seats, while a party that gets 2.9% gets nothing, no seat whatsoever, and the seats that it would have gotten get distributed proportionally among the other parties. So here is a series of possible outcomes. Syriza is getting 25%, New Democracy is getting 22%. That's more or less the expectations from the polls. Golden Dawn is getting 6%, Kukwe, the Communists 5%, Potami 6%, PASOK 4.2%, Independent Greeks 2.5%. Okay. If this is the case, then the results are in the first line, 77 members of parliament for New Democracy, 137 for Syriza. Let me show you what will happen if instead of 25%, it goes to 30%. 30%. You see that immediately it goes to 141. Now, if the independent Greeks, instead of 2.5%, they become 3.5%, that's the potential coalition, they get 11 members, and along with 141, they get 152, which is a majority out of 300. So you can see that the electoral system is such that what matters most is who is the first party. But the second thing that matters is which party gets represented in the parliament. And who is going to be represented in the parliament, right now it is in flux because there are different personalities that go to parties and they say, I'm going to be with you, I can bring you votes, so do you want me? And then it depends on the personal relation among these people whether this important personality is going to go with party A or with party B, and that will affect, because the 3% threshold propagates uncertainty throughout the system. So that is going to be the situation, and that is what is going to be resolved in around 20 days. What I want you to know is that you should not pay very much attention to the polls for a series of reasons. The first one is they do not, for economic reasons, they do not poll people with cell phones. Now that means no youth. Youth is a very malleable and fluctuating percentage of the, not percentage, but intentional vote in the electorate. And so we really don't know what these people are going to do. That's one thing, and by itself it is enough not to know what is going to happen. The second thing is that we also have a very bad track record of the polls. For example, in the referendum that came out to be 62-38, the expectation was 50-50. Okay, so what is going to happen, we will really not know until the 20th of September. Now, let me go back to the negotiations. This is what is happening in the Greek situation. Syriza does not have a strategy, he wants to do it on his own. He is not going to have an absolute majority. The major party that, not the major, the minor party that he wants to be with him, the independent Greeks, most likely will not enter the parliament at all. And he declares that he doesn't want to make any coalitions with anybody. Okay, so it's going to be a very difficult outcome to predict in terms of what will the negotiations produce after the election. With respect to Europe now, the European Union has not budged throughout the 7 months of the negotiations. Why? One thing is that they have all the money and they were not giving, and they continue not to give money to Greece except on a conditional basis. That is, what are you going to do? What kind of conditions are you going to meet so that you will get the next installment of the debt? So that is one. It had all the weapons, the substantive weapons. The second thing that the Greeks did not understand is that the decision-making in the European Union is through unanimity, which means that once you defend the status quo, as Mr. Scholl was doing, it's not just that you have to, it's another 28 people that you have to persuade. Okay? Even if you were able to make some reasonable arguments that the Greek government was not able to do, still they would be able to persuade 1 or 2 or 5. Instead, they alienated the Germans because they were going to give them money, the Southern Europeans because they had already paid their share of their debt and they didn't want Greece to violate the rules. They offended the people from the Eastern Europe because they had lower per capita income, and they were saying, we want to pay pensions 500 euros, while the people in Eastern Europe had 300 euros for pensions. And they were saying, why am I going to pay taxes so that you are going to increase the pensions of your own people? So this unanimity part of the story is an extremely important feature, which is, on the one hand, handicapped completely the negotiations of Greece, but on the other hand, is going to be handicapping Europe in the future. Okay? And this is part of a bigger problem that I am investigating right now, that it's very difficult to change constitutions. In every advanced industrialized country, we put in everything that we want in the constitution. How am I going to get out of here? Here. In every country, we put everything we want to protect in the constitution. And we say, we are going to have the independence of judges, put it in the constitution. We cannot violate that. We want to have freedom of press, put it in the constitution. We want to have free education. Okay? Let's put it in the constitution. It's a great idea. In Chile, they want to make a constitutional revision and put the freedom of education, free education, as part of the constitution. So here is the story, what is going to be happening. If you take the length of the constitution in all the OECD countries and how rigid the constitution is, it becomes, the bigger the constitution, the more rigid it becomes. The more difficult it is to change. Okay? Now, the next step that I'm going to show you is what would you expect to happen in terms of how often and how effectively these constitutions are changed. You would think that the more difficult it is, the less it's going to be changing. Yes? And here is what happens. The length of the constitution and amendment frequency. Okay? The bigger the constitution, the more frequently we amend it. Let me tell you about Europe. The European Constitution, in order to change, it requires unanimity. Okay? Every 3 years, there is a constitutional convention which tries, and lots of times succeeds at, in some respect, changing the European Constitution. So we have the Single European Act, the Maastricht Treaty, the Amsterdam Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, all of them have modified the European Constitution. It requires unanimity. What it means, which is the big and important message that I am trying to convey, is that by making the constitutions so difficult, whenever we do not want them, we are going to go and amend them, we are violating the number one principle, or number, I don't know what number, principle in economics, rules better than discretion. Okay? We are creating a situation where instead of having the rules regulating the constitution and then abiding by these rules, we consider the rules as fair game and we play with them. Okay? So having a constitution in the European Union that does not allow any modification is a big problem. Think about Grexit was a negotiation today. However, tomorrow is going to be Brexit. Britain is going to come up to this situation. There is a huge army of immigrants coming through the borders. Okay? Well, Greece has a very different attitude towards immigrants than Estonia, for obvious reasons. Okay? Can we have a unanimous system in order to decide what are we going to do with immigrants? There is no way that we are going to be solving these problems having a unanimity principle to tie our hands. Okay? So this is something that exists not only in Europe, but exists in all the advanced industrialized countries, as you can see, and this is something that we should be discussing.
before Professor Bachmann starts, could everybody in the center move in so that we can get more people seated? Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks for having me. I guess I'm supposed to be the tough German, although I'm pretty sure Chris is, as he said, the tougher German. I'm going to skip the timeline of the recent, the most central events, which basically starts as the Treaty of Maastricht and then goes through all the way when in January 2002 the euro notes were actually introduced and the people of Europe physically got to feel that they had a new currency. Technically they had it before, but it's kind of nice to actually feel currency physically, I guess. What I want to do is just show you a bunch of graphs to put sort of essentially just visualize what Chris already said in words, and then I'm going to talk a bit about policy options at the end. Okay? So here, I apologize, some of these figure titles are in German because I pulled this off from German publications, but the titles on the slide will tell you what it is. So this is the effective interest rate on 10-year treasuries, Germany versus Greece, and you can exactly see what Chris described. Versus the blue line is the Greek government's interest rate, and you can see kind of while it was much higher than Germany's, it kind of converges. And at the beginning of the euro in 2001, basically in 2002, the spread was zero. They basically collapsed. Then you have this massive spike back up. And then we have it lower down again through some of these policy measures, and more recently it's gotten up again. Okay, and this is basically the same thing for more countries. Greece, Spain. You see a lot of southern European countries that have this similar spike, but not quite as big as in magnitude. And you can also see that all these other countries actually have come down quite a bit, and even though they're not quite at Germany's level, they're still. They're reasonable interest rates, I guess, right now in the current situation. So that's sort of the development of the interest rate. So a lot of people have argued then that because of this conversion of the interest rate, you got to imagine basically what would you do? You have lived for decades in a situation where you paid 25% or even more on your credit line, okay? And now all of a sudden you pay only 5%, okay? What are you going to do, okay? A lot of people have argued this basically. The Greeks basically went into a spending spree. You start consuming, you kind of, really, and partially also investing, and you buy stuff, okay? Because it's cheap to buy stuff for you. So a lot of people have argued that there's sort of a credit bubble, but actually, if you look at sort of the growth, you see this a bit in the growth rate. This is the year-over-year growth rate in gross domestic product between Germany, which is the red line, and the blue line. And you kind of can see sort of this divergence at the beginning, sort of the Eurozone, where Germany was the so-called sick man of Europe. So Germany hadn't always been the power of Europe. On the contrary, actually, sort of Germany was in a long-lasting recession or slump at the beginning of the 2000s, which was probably a lot of people argue the mirror image of sort of the boom in the South. But then again, if you look a bit sort of longer, it's not clear to me necessarily that, although there is a bit of an overheating, a bit of a sort of a growth spurt going on, Greece before they went into the euro, despite the high interest rates, actually had a fairly robust growth level, at least in the 90s, that most of the time actually exceeded Germany's. This is the growth rate. And then, of course, now we have this massive collapse. They had the same initial collapse in growth around the time of the crisis, but then of course Germany recovered very quickly versus Greece is just about to recover now. So it's a bit unclear to me that we really had this credit bubble, this overheating. Maybe a bit in this graph, but it's not so striking as you might have thought.
I just want to thank Rudy for advertising. I run that data shop.
Exactly. Yes, he runs this data shop. Yeah, and it's a great profession to the service. So this is about the development of the relative price level of Greece relative to the European average. Okay, and there you can see a bit clearer why Greece is part of this mess. So it has this relatively massive increase of 16% of inflation, sort of relative relative to the rest of Europe. And that basically tells you a bit about sort of the slow erosion of what we call international competitiveness. Right? If your prices go up by so much more, you know, how are you going to sell stuff? Okay, and we saw a bit of a collapse here after the sort of the crisis, -8%. These are two hypothetical numbers under two scenarios that I pulled off from the IFO Institute. They did basically calculation how much the price level would have to collapse to restore sort of Greek competitiveness sort of to sustainable levels, depending on what assumptions you make on the debt forgiveness. You basically get different numbers, but whatever they are, the argument here is still that the prices haven't come down nearly enough to sort of make Greece an export powerhouse again. Okay, so this is the this is the development of government debt and GDP. Okay, here this is the black line is GDP. You can't actually see this all that much, the decline. The decline is massive, but it's a bit sort of distorted in this graph. Here, this is sort of part of the initial debt forgiveness that Greece actually had. This was this increase. And this is basically the ratio. This is what the famous debt to GDP ratio, where Greece is now sort of about, you know, it had this massive increase towards the 2012. I apologize here for this mess. Then they had a bit of debt forgiveness, which actually reduced the debt to GDP ratio. But then mainly actually because, and you can see this here, not so much the absolute level of debt kept increasing, but sort of the economy went into a tank, so the debt to GDP ratio actually spiraled up again to this now infamous 180%. And today, now, as far as at least I checked this a bit, as far as I know, only Japan, currently, and Zimbabwe have higher debt to GDP ratios in the world. Okay, and here you can see better what actually happened to the sort of the Greek. That's sort of the Great Depression. This is normalized to 100. Depending on if you look industrial production or real GDP, you basically get sort of a 30% collapse of economic activity through this crisis. And even sort of perhaps more striking is the unemployment rate. This is the overall unemployment rate. And this, to me, is the even more sort of worrisome number, which is the youth unemployment. I mean, there are issues with calculating youth unemployment, but according, if you take this number at face value, that basically says that 50% of the Greek youth, basically, that are not in school, are basically unemployed today. And this is a massive social tragedy. Okay. Now, I will take, so now let's move a bit to policy. I will take a bit of an issue with what George said before, namely that the Greeks didn't get any money. They actually got a lot of money, depending on how you count it. There's a bit of an issue of what they used it for, or what they were forced to use it for, but they still got a lot of money. So this is a calculation of the public loans from government entities out of Europe that were given to the Greek government. Okay, so they're sort of outright sort of bailout loans through various bailout mechanisms in the European Union. But then you also have through details that I don't want to get into, but through essentially various intricacies of how central bank clearing works, intercentral bank clearing works in the monetary union. They basically got a lot of credits, loans, essentially through the ECB, okay, and through the Greek National Bank, which basically the Greek National Bank essentially has like a checking account that it can draw until the very day, basically loans from the ECB, okay? Now the expectation, of course, is as long as the monetary union stays together, that these credits will be paid back. And so this is sort of, at this point, this is all virtual numbers, all virtual loans, okay? But it is the case that Greek commercial banks, until at least very recently, could give out loans to Greek citizens, refinance these loans from the European Central Bank, and if you were smart as a Greek, and that what happened a lot, you would take this money, these were hard euros, and put it into a London or Berlin-based account, okay? And so once it's out of the country, it can never be subject to a potential Brexit. Okay, so this would have been, or if there is a Brexit, if there's a collapse of the monetary union, this would actually be hard cash that they would take out. So, and then here I want to, this is an estimate of sort of the annual sort of interest rate obligation as a fraction of the interest obligation of the Greek government as a fraction of the GDP. And you can kind of see here that Greece already did quite get a bit of debt reduction, de facto debt reduction. Okay, so in 2011 was actually they had to pay between roughly 7% of their GDP on interest, but because of some of the debt forgiveness and the recent measures and the extensions of some of these loans, the de facto payment Greece is now paying a less sort of total amount of interest than, for example, as a fraction of its GDP than Portugal and Italy. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind. So there has already been some form of debt reduction. People can argue whether that has been enough. Okay, all right. So much for the graphs. Now let me just go a bit to the questions. Where do we go from here? Okay, so the big question, of course, is Brexit or not. Okay. From an economic point of view, I would argue that it could be an effective way to restore Greek competitiveness. Okay, we have relatively good evidence that where this has happened. Of course, you have to not just do a Brexit, you also have to do a government default. That goes without saying. Of course, if you just keep the debt on the books, that's a disaster. But of course, a Brexit would go hand in hand with a government default. And we know how we have a good idea through empirical. I mean, this has happened in the world, so we have some experience post-war, even post-World War II. There's roughly, I guess, 70 cases, depending on how you count, where this has more or less happened. We know it's tremendous short-term suffering, but in most of these cases, you have a relatively rapid and sort of rapid growth in the medium run, so a relatively rapid rebound. Okay, at least if you sort of accompany it by policies on the supply side. Of course, this would have to be to get rid of some of this short-term suffering. The European Union, and there's a political will, I think, in Europe to sort of accompany this with outright transfers for humanitarian reasons. Okay, so they would have to send in potentially prescription drugs. They have to subsidize gas and stuff like that. But I think there's a clear political will to do that, or would have been. Okay, and you probably also would have to coordinate monetary policy with the then independent Greek central bank and the ECB to prevent sort of an utter collapse of the drachma. You want the drachma to devalue roughly by maybe another 20% to restore competitiveness, but you don't want it to collapse to bottom up. That would be a disaster. So you would have to kind of coordinate between the ECB. The problem with this is the economics about it, and that's why a lot of people, both on the political right, by the way, and political left, if you ask Krugman, he would probably more or less, for example, Paul Krugman, he would probably more or less agree on that, and so would a lot of more conservative economists. The political will in Europe, however, is dead set against it. Okay, and I think it has been made pretty clear that they are not going to do this. Okay, and we can speculate why that is. There might be a sort of a fear of a reverse contagion. At the very beginning of the crisis, people have said we can't do Brexit because Portugal and Italy are going to do it as well, and everything is going to collapse too, and that's why we can't do it. Now I think actually the fear is the other way, that it could very well be, knowing what we know from historic episodes, that might actually work in the medium run, that other countries might figure out, I'm better off without the euro too, and so Italy, Portugal, Spain might leave eventually. And so that's, I think, a lot part of the fear also in Germany, that that's why they are so dead set against the Brexit. Be that as it may, since there seems to be a political will against Brexit, politicians and there are also sort of accused Schäuble of this. I think this was not a smart thing he did during the negotiations. Keep sort of the Brexit on the table all the time. We should just stop talking about it. Okay, economists academic economists have the right to talk about it as long as it sort of stays as a possibility in academia. But sort of at the end of the day, when we make policy recommendations, I think as of now, we should just take the existence of the euro in Greece as a constraint, okay, and should optimize around that and think what is the best way within the euro for Greece, okay? Because this still lingering danger of Brexit is, as you might imagine, a huge investment killer. Right? Who's going to go inside Greece now and invest now when they expect that 2 months later they can have the same investment for half the price? And it's also a capital fight producer because, of course, people want the euro that they have, they want to bring out of Greece so that they can't be exchanged to cheaper drachma. Okay, they want to deposit that in London banks. Okay, so we should commit to not exit, to no Brexit, as much as this is possible. Okay, and because if you want to do it, then do it faster without talking much about it in order to avoid all these expectation effects. So what do they do instead? Okay, so what are they actually doing? Now, say that Brexit is off the table. The two sort of core measures in these agreements are privatization and tax increases. Okay, and I think they suck. Okay, this is the worst thing you could possibly do. Okay, privatization, we know it's not going to happen. They tried it already, and that's I'm not even sure the Greek got all that much of a bad deal. I would also take issue with some of what other people have said to them, because everyone in Europe knows that these are boilerplate measures. They're not going to privatize. They're not going to raise 50 billion euro as they are supposed to through privatization, because nobody's going to buy that stuff at that price. Okay, and tax increases is a sure way of killing your economic growth. Okay, especially in a country where you already have problems actually collecting the tax revenue. Okay, so tax rate increases are not going to help you. Statutory tax rate increases are not going to help you at all. And getting sort of the administration set up to actually start these tax collections, good luck with that. That will take a while. Okay, so I think we need to think a bit differently, and I'm trying to sort of advertise a bit of a sort of a common sense mix between what we could call standard demand side and standard supply side policies. Okay, so what about, instead of taking all this European money, okay, what about, let's think about smart public investment. For example, solar green energy. Okay, what the Greeks have is sun. Okay, that's a good endowment, a good natural endowment. Let's harvest that and send it to the rest of Europe. Give foreign investment tax credits. Tell a foreign firm, you come in, you invest maybe in a special, a la China, in a special economic zone, commercial zone. If you invest in, I don't know, Thessaloniki, I'm going to give you 10 years of no tax reduction, of zero taxes. Okay? Have what we call sort of a VAT swap. Lower the taxes now to get tourism in, okay? But also say that we're going to increase the tax revenue in the future through VAT taxes. Lower labor taxes now, okay? You don't want to raise taxes, you won't need to make Greek products cheaper, and we call this in economics, we call this internal devaluation. And if partly finance this with increase in property taxes, if you can, that's a problem in Greece, we talked about this, but do as much as you can to finance this, and use European money sort of to bridge until hopefully some of these policies work and get you growth, so that the tax revenue will actually increase. So I think this is sort of a common sense sort of mix of supply side and demand side economies. On the more longer term, I think that this is sort of the immediate measures that I would advocate. And if the Europeans are going to pay money, they should pay money for something that's actually useful and grow growth. Okay? On the longer term, I think we need to think a bit harder about how to make this a really stabilized system, given that we want this to be for eternity, this EMU, which the politicians apparently have decided that this is going to be. Okay? I think the one crucial thing that we need, and this is not my idea, this has been advertised by a lot of American economists recently, is a Europeanized banking system. Okay, if necessary, through harsh regulation. It cannot be that, why is the US as a currency union working? Okay, the government of California defaults, okay, not much is happening, okay? It's true that a bunch of public workers in California don't get money immediately, but they're paid per IOUs. But there are no bank runs, okay, because people that have their money in Chase, California, they know that Chase is not going to go under because the Californian state is going to go bankrupt. That's totally different in Europe. It's the opposite in Europe, right? The banking systems are so married to their national governments, okay? The moment the national governments are in trouble, the banking system are in trouble with bankrupts, okay? We need to get rid of this. We need to get, and I also want to talk about the closeness of the national banking system and the national financial sector and the governments is, gives way to all kinds of crony capitalism situations, financial crony capitalism situations. We should get rid of this, okay? If necessary, through very harsh regulation. In other words, if you want a bank charter in Europe, you cannot hold your government debt. What you need to hold is a rated market portfolio of government of all European countries' debt, okay? Similarly, with asymmetric monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, cannot go in and say, okay, Illinois is in trouble, I'm going to buy Illinois debt. They can only buy federal debt, okay? Same thing we should do in Europe. whether you do this with Eurobonds or not, or just a synthetic market portfolio of existing European bonds, is a matter of taste, I would say. We probably need a European sovereign default law. We need a clear legal system for European governments. If none of this works, this should be sort of the first level of defense. But if none of this works, we need a clear legal framework under what conditions and with what sequence of who gets what, basically, when a government defaults. We need a law for that, and we don't have it. Okay? Do we need Eurobonds? Maybe. Do we need a European Secretary of the Treasury with an own budget, as a lot of economists argue? Maybe. I'm not sure you actually need it. I think this might be enough, but we don't know, I think. Do we need also social insurance between European countries, the way you have it in the United States? Of course, part of the reason why, when California is in trouble, not so much is happening is because the federal government steps in and, through Medicaid, Medicare, the federal unemployment insurance, helps the citizens of California so that they are not so dependent on their own government when they are in trouble. Maybe we need that. I don't know. This is a political decision that ultimately economists don't have much to say about it, except we can discuss what the implication of this would be. Whether you want this as a policy matter is basically a matter of your own social welfare function. Okay? Last thoughts. Be honest in this debate. Okay? When I hear in Germany politicians say, we're never going to have a debt reduction in the Greek. I'm not going to get a haircut. Maybe we'll have an interest rates relief or deferred payment schemes. That is a debt reduction, okay? And if you have an Econ 101 education, that is a debt reduction is exactly the same. So be honest and don't lie to your people. And politicians right now, including in Germany, are lying to their citizens, okay? And this is just, I think it's just dishonest. I also want to this has been coming up also, Paul Krugman and some, especially Anglo-Saxon historians, have made this comparison between Germany somehow has a moral obligation because debt reduction after World War II. This is in my view, this is a completely separate case. You shouldn't try and draw any moral equivalencies here, because let's not forget that Germany was subject to total surrender and total capitulation. You want to do this in Greece before you get debt reduction? I don't know, okay? So let's be honest, let's be historically honest about these things, okay? I think we'll always need an intelligent mix between carrots and sticks. We probably will have some debt forgiveness, but there will always be some conditionality on it. Okay, we need the right amount of micromanagement, and that's hard. On the one end, you have Schäuble, so a lot of economists have argued, why are you prescribing all these detailed measures? Why aren't you just telling Greece, okay, you need to produce a primary deficit of X% and a current account surplus of Y%? And how you do it, we don't care. Okay? In a frictionless world, that would be indeed the best, because you don't want to mess around with sort of Greek democracy and you don't want to micromanage Greek politics. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that who in Greece will sort of bear the burden of these various measures, is a matter of debate. And apparently, it's not easy for the Greek political system to come up or to decide who is actually going to be the eventual bearer of these conditions. And so you probably need even a bit of micromanagement to do this. Although, and this is sort of on the other hand, this is a problem for European democracy and state sovereignty, that you have this situation that Germany, what used to be a situation between Greece and the international capital markets, is now a situation between, between sovereign states mainly, because they transformed the private debt, the Greek government debt that was held in private hands, and the debtors are all public entities. Okay, and it's pretty much a good old wisdom that you probably shouldn't lend to your friend, because that will clearly end your friendship. And this is exactly what's happening right now in Europe. Okay, so this is a problem for European democracy to which I don't have an answer. I hope we will get closer, maybe even in this debate. Okay?
Thank you very much. So, thanks to all of our three panelists. Don't lend to your friends. So, if they're your friends. I should say, the Nanovic Institute's custom is to invite questions first and foremost from students. So, which of you has a question? Yes, sir.
Hi there, just a quick question regarding property tax. I noticed that was one of the bullet points listed on the last presentation. So why is property tax such an issue in Greece? I've seen that in a number of publications.
You want to say something, or should I? Why this is a problem to collect it? Yeah. Well,
Sorry.
yeah, maybe George can say more about it. But as far as I know, they simply very often don't even know to whom a particular lot even belongs. So there's no sort of central register of who actually owns property. Okay, that's one thing. And then there are all kinds of, I guess, tax evasion schemes where, or taxes simply not enforced because of political cronyism that doesn't make this work. In theory, I agree with you. Property taxes are a good way to tax people because it's hard to avoid them, right? I mean, you have a lot. You can't just move the lot out of the country, right? As opposed to your financial wealth. You can't stop working, like with labor taxes. So property taxes are an excellent way of taxing people. The question is, do you have the political will to actually implement it? And the ability.
Yeah, it is true that we don't have a property list with who owns what. We know that lots of things belong to the government, lots of things belong to the church, and they are not exploited in any way. They are not used. Then lots of pieces of land go from generation to generation, and so you may have inherited a big piece of land from your father, but you are unemployed. Okay? If they tax your property, it means that you essentially, they are going to take it away. And so there are lots of people who object to it. Then the next thing is, because lots of property markets are spot markets, that is, a property next to the beach was sold 5 years ago, and that's the only thing that in the whole area was sold. It was sold at a very high price, and you have a piece of land that is, 1,000 meters away, so it has nothing to do with the beach. And then the 10 years ago sale was used in order for you to pay taxes in your piece of land that has completely different conditions. And then lots of people object to that too. Okay, I mean, I'm speaking about justifiable objections, not that they don't want to pay. They say it's not fair for me to pay the same price as if I had a piece of land by the sea. So there are all these problems that are compounding the situation, and as a result, it's really, really very difficult to tax land.
Hello. Do you believe that the Eurozone has been an overall failure so far in that it really provides a lack of flexibility in terms of monetary policy and other measures for these individual countries? Because Greece is very different than Germany, and all these countries have their own characteristics, and kind of lumping them together with a single currency really kind of handcuffs them in what they can do to aid in getting out of economic downturns and situations.
I'll address this. One of the things that, and people always ask this question, I say, why don't we have 50 currencies in the U.S.? By that same logic, every state should have its own currency. In fact, why not every city?
Missouri is very different from Connecticut.
Very different. The difference is, and Rudy was alluding to it, he didn't say the actual words, is the biggest problem with the way Europe is structured, they don't have a fiscal union. They have a trade union, they have a monetary union, but they do not have a fiscal union, and all this stuff is fiscal. So this is why, as
Well,
Rudy
we don't have a
said,
banking union. I don't even
Right.
know how much we need a fiscal union. That's a bit of a matter of debate. The problem right now is that we don't have a banking union. We don't have a European banking system. I think that's one of the crucial parts that is currently missing that you have in the United States.
I mean,
Again, there's no dependence of the individual state and the banks in that state.
right. So the other issue would be take California and their pensions, suppose they default on their pensions, they still have Social Security. That's a federal system. So we have these fiscal transfers to some extent that go across states. And that's what helps us maintain all this. This is partly why the Fed's not allowed to step in and do anything for a single individual state, which the ECB has basically kept the Greek banking system alive for the last 3 years. Those banks would have failed in 2012 if the ECB hadn't stepped in and became their permanent lender, because nobody else in the world would lend to them. So I think that's the bigger issue for Europe. I agree very strongly with Rudy that this idea that you have your own national private banks. I used to do a lot of advising in Ukraine in the late 90s. They were trying to get their own banking system going. And I kept saying, why? Just let Citibank come in. Just let Deutsche Bank come in. Just let ING come in. They're established. The people will be safe and all that. The bigger problem is like deposit insurance protection. If banks kind of fail in, to some extent in Greece. I just found this out talking with one of the ECB governors last week. You know, even though you'll see subsidiaries in these countries, so you'll see a Deutsche Bank subsidiary, that's a separate bank. It says Deutsche Bank, but it's not. It's a different bank. And until you get bankruptcy laws in all the states similar, and lots of other financial laws the same, you're not going to get this banking. So you have to have a lot of other stuff that gets, and that often comes back to legal stuff, and it works best if you do it at the national level.
I would like to give the political dimension in this. Yes, there is a different economic situation in Georgia than there is in Minnesota. However, there is also a politically different, say, Democratic Party in Texas than there is in Minnesota. Okay? And nevertheless, in the United States, the political system gets unified and all these different Democratic parties get together because we have a presidential election, okay, where somebody from all the Democrats, whether it is from the South or from the East or from the North or from the West, gets to be the representative, and then his ideas are introduced in front of all the American people, and he has to win the different states. There is no equivalent in Europe. Okay? There is nobody in Europe who is a representative of the European people. Okay? So if you are Schäuble, you are responsible in front of the German people who are the lenders, and therefore you want to get your money back. As a secondary consideration is what is going to happen to the European Union. If you are Tsipras, you are a debtor and you want your debt to be forgiven, and that is what is going to, if you are able to do that, that is going to give you capital, political capital. Okay? There is nobody throughout Europe, there is no European election. For the European Parliament, you get elected by the country that you represent, and only that country. So, for example, the German parties, whether it is the Social Democratic Party or the Christian Democratic Party, being in government together, want fiscal responsibility. The Greek parties, on the other hand, whether it is Syriza or whether it is New Democracy, the right-wing party, wanted their absolution of the debt. Okay? And now, if you are Greece, how are you going to deal with this situation? There is no European institutions that will deal with it. You will have to go, that's what Tsipras was asking. I want to meet with Merkel. Okay, you're going to go to Merkel and then ask for your debt to be forgiven, and she's going to say, no, go back to the institutions. So there is no aggregating method for the European preferences so that the different countries will have a different representation on the basis, say, of ideology or European interest or whatever.
So I agree with all you said. I'm not sure though, I think we don't know, and this is an open question because we haven't really done it successfully, whether we need all that for the successful running of a currency union. I think that's unclear, whether we need that centralized political representation. We know that in the United States it has and it works more or less. The question is this really a necessary condition or not really a sufficient condition? I think that we don't know. I think that's absolutely an open question. And the problem that we are in right now, that Tsebelis had wanted to talk to Merkel and it didn't work, is merely through the fact that we are in a situation where we should never have been in, namely in the situation where countries, these member countries, are being debtors to each other. That is a situation we should have never come into. This is going back to this idea that you shouldn't lend to your friends. These countries should individually lend from capital markets, and capital markets should monitor their fiscal discipline, and then they can do whatever they want fiscally. And Merkel and Schäuble, that's the problem of European democracy, of where we are in right now. Namely, the danger for European democracy and sovereignty, individual sovereignty, is that Merkel and Schäuble, have to mess around with Greek politics, something which they should never do. They should never do this. This is it should be the international capital markets to regulate what Greeks can do with their GDP or not.
Yeah, on that point, we saw what that led to, which is no lending at all. So that was the only reason that this government lending, as you mentioned, stepped in. So if in 2012 Europe had not stepped in, Greece would have collapsed beyond anything we've already seen. They would have been completely shut out of all lending. There would have been no deficits run whatsoever, and that would have been it. So, I mean, the capital markets, Rudy's point is correct, as long as they're willing to make any loans to you. If they don't, like they did in 2012, and they haven't come back, by the way.
Well, maybe you become a bit more expensive if you know that you can't rely on,
No, I'm just saying the punishment on Greece would have been far worse than it has been.
I agree.
So the private sector can punish sometimes a lot harder than governments can.
I agree.
Do we have any more student questions? If you're a student, you look like a student. Like your head up.
So Greece has seen a lot of deflation in the last few years, and especially the labor wages have gone down 20%. Now my question is, even after deflation, most of the products and the labor wages going down, why aren't the Greek products getting competitive with respect to the German products or some other products?
I showed you the graph. It's true that wages have fallen, the price level hasn't fallen nearly as much and nearly as necessary as it should. That's a problem for Greek competitiveness, especially Hans Werner Sinn, sort of a German media economist, always make this point, a bit oversimplified, but I think there's a lot of truth there. Compare Greece to Turkey. Similar food, similar water, similar climate, and Greeks, the Turks are just cheaper for tourism. And so, if you are not a European, you decide, okay, well, I'm going on vacation. I'm going to Greece, I'm not going to Turkey. You choose Turkey right now; it's much cheaper. And that is just that in alone, especially if tourism is one of your biggest sources of revenue, that just is not a sustainable solution.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I wanted to ask about Tsebelis. Tsebelis started presenting himself as this person who was going to channel people's demands. He carried out a referendum clearly against what Europe wanted him to do. He then pretty much reneged on what he was planning to do because he found himself in a very untenable situation. Now he resigned mainly because he didn't have the support of his party and his coalition. And now I'm guessing that in the month that leads up to these new elections, he's going to be able to centralize his party, and he's going to be able to, if he obtains a majority, to be able to govern again. Do you see him as a temporary phenomenon? Do you see him as somebody who is in for the long run, despite the fact that so far he has been swaying and he has gone from one extreme to the other? Do you see any viable opposition which is going to be able to return to a more normal level of politics?
Well, right now, he is the necessary solution for, he's a participant in any necessary solution. And by staying out, he can't prevent anything from happening. That's exactly what he did. That's why he brings the country to new elections. And even if after the election he forms a coalition, he could have formed it ahead of time and saved us lots of time and money. Now, he has lied big way to the Greek people. He has promised everything in the sky, and he brought the situation significantly worse. I mean, you saw in the graphics that at the end of 2014, we were coming out of the recession, and now we are back in. Now, at some point, I mean, there is this rational expectations principle that you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. At some point, this is going to catch up with him. Right now, the electoral campaign is where he says that I disagree with this policy, but I am the best one to change this policy, and he's going to bring an alternative policy along with the memorandum. Okay? And he believes that he's going to pull it through. I believe that he will pull it through because it is in a month, actually in 20 days. If it were in 3 months, he wouldn't. Okay, so we have an election that is going to give him the first position, and I don't know what he's going to do after that. I mean, some people say he may go to a new election, which would be an absolute catastrophe. Okay? Now, if it were a bit further down, because he gets hammered from the right and from the left, from the right because they say we were telling you that you should be doing these things, and from the left because you are doing exactly the opposite from what all of us were saying and promising, this is going to have negative effect in the long run, but not right now.
We have, let's say, not a lot of time left. Why don't we collect some questions? I know, sir, you've had your hand up. No? Yeah.
Very simple.
But are there other questions? I want to see if we can just collect up here. One there. Okay, so we'll start off with you.
I'm Italian, and after 27 whatever years of European community, I don't think my country has taken any real advantage of progress. There was a lot of money, investments coming back and forth, but the final result is today that the majority of our industry has been purchased in large part by German groups or some other international groups. The same thing is happening in Greece because all the airports have been just purchased by a German group. All the ports are going to be sold. So in essence, what I'm saying is that the southern countries, Spain, Italy, and Greece, and are those who are really going to keep. Whatever is the reason, I don't want to blame anyone, but the final effect is that my country today is much poorer than it was 25 years ago. So I would like to know if you share this impression, and and based on your opinion, if the Brexit is such a negative solution.
Thank you. And Alan?
May I ask what your country is?
My country? Italy.
Italy.
Okay.
This is very basic. The phrase Greek competitiveness is being used. I'm wondering what sort of economic activity is this in reference to? We know about tourism. There's yogurt, presumably, and there are olives and peaches, but what are we talking about?
Cheese.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes?
This is a little bit like a question on Tsipras. I have been puzzled for so long about Yanis Varoufakis and what his rationale as finance minister was in the way that he handled himself in regard to the EU. And since you are a game theory person, I wondered if you could, by any chance, have anything to do with game theory.
And is that good or bad? Any other questions? Let's start with you, Rudy, and then work our way down. Oh, there was another one?
There are more questions here and there.
Oh, okay. Well, quick questions, Mike.
Yeah, not much discussion has occurred about the geopolitical issues surrounding what would happen to Greece if Greece collapsed. You know, with all of the influx of refugees from the Middle East, Africa, the instability in the region. You know, how do we account for this, and how does one put some numbers and principles behind it?
Yes.
I was wondering about you saying that a lot of the property in Greece is owned by the government. And I've heard proposals to have the government sort of sell off some of that land just to gain additional revenue now. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that would be, especially in relation to, say, the tax break for foreign direct investment.
Any more? Okay, Rudy.
Okay, so with regard to economic activity. So what could the Greeks do? First of all, there's tourism. There's a lot of agriculture that is not being used right now. As far as I know, Greece is a net importer of yogurt, actually, interestingly enough. Okay? Something that tomato, which something is probably not a good idea, right? They used to have a cotton industry, a cotton growing industry, which is basically collapsed. But it's not just so much that you can export, it's also that you will get import substitution, right? You will just have, at some point, because foreign goods are more expensive for you, you will have to start producing your own stuff. So small manufacturing will come back. Sort of the industrial structure is not, the economists say it's endogenous. It's endogenous to the relative crisis you're facing with the current country. So that just because you're not doing some stuff or producing some stuff now, under these relative prices, doesn't mean that you wouldn't produce them later. And thirdly, there would be, if the drachma is cheap, and again, I'm not necessarily advocating the Brexit because there are disadvantages to it, but another scenario is, or another effect that you would have is that, Greek real estate would be dirt cheap, and a lot of Greek oligarchs that are currently buying, the fancy flats in London and Berlin, they would presumably go back and buy good real estate in Greece, and they would renovate it, so you would get a construction boom. And then, hopefully, once you have a construction boom, more people get to work, they buy other consumption goods, and so on and so forth. That's sort of the idea behind how a devaluation, in principle, would work with all the problems. Geopolitical, there's a lot to say about this, but I'm not going to touch this. As opposed to Varoufakis, my personal analysis is I'm not sure you need game theory to analyze it. My personal view is you need a psychiatrist.
You agree, well,
he's a narcissist.
Yes, let me start from the geopolitical. Yes, there are lots of consequences. It's supposedly a European country in a very unstable Middle East, and so it could be a very useful ally for a NATO country. So not letting in, and apparently Obama has stepped in. One of the reasons that he stepped in and he told Merkel many times, don't let Greece go, was this. On the other hand, the Greek government had used a catastrophic kind of strategy where they were going to Russia and they were talking with Putin and they were saying, we are looking for safe havens. Okay? At the moment that the European Union was negotiating how to save the Brexit. Okay? So instead of being a paragon of stability and showing to the Europeans and to the Americans that if you have us on your side, you are going to be better off, and this is a big asset for you, they were becoming a paragon of instability. Okay, so they had a very wrong strategy. Now, with respect to Varoufakis, yes, I agree completely. I mean, people were saying that the Europeans, Scholl and the rest, he may be a very good academic, but he has problems. He's not a good academic.
Absolutely.
And
he's not.
And he has these problems, but the major thing that the whole government had, and they recognized it, is they were thinking that if we go to Europe and we say that if you don't play ball with us, we are going to have Brexit and you are going to suffer, which is what they were saying for 7 months. Okay? Then at some point Scholl said, we are going to pay you so that you get out of here. Okay? Then they realized that this is not a solution and that the Europeans were not going to budge because Greece was going to get out. So they acknowledge that already now, that it is a mistaken conception, and essentially every time that you are in what is called the prison chicken game, okay, you are trying to persuade the other guy that you are not going to swear. Okay, and that's what the Greek government was doing until the last moment. One of the two is going to be a chicken, and obviously, given that the European Union had all the cash, and the European Union had the unanimity rule, and the Greeks didn't understand neither one nor the other, and they were saying, we are going to play for time. Okay, we are going to bring Brexit closer and closer until they get scared. Okay, that is a fundamental, completely off the chart conception that then leads to the outcome.
Chris?
I'll just touch on a couple things. So what is kind of amazing is tourism is just a shade under 20% of GDP in Greece, so it's huge. That's bigger than the entire healthcare system in the US, and not another industry as big as that. So anything that they can do to export tourism, good luck, but I think Rudy's point is people right now, their price levels are outrageously high. The geopolitical stuff, I remember, Jack Lew was telling Scholl to bail out the Greeks, don't let them go, and Scholl looked at him and said, I'll trade you Greece for Puerto Rico. Why aren't you don't come here and talk to us, and you're watching one of your commonwealths collapse on your own watch and somehow telling us that we shouldn't do it. So I think this is exactly where you get into these geopolitical, but at the same time, you have Russia creating all sorts of trouble in Eastern Europe. I mean, the Ukraine thing is not nice. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're already nervous about this because the Russians are semi-threatening them, and they're already in the EU. So this is not a pleasant thing. So again, going to Russia when you're Greece, thinking that's going to somehow gain you some bargaining power, that was a disaster. On the Brexit, I sort of had this view that, well, it's not a view, but Brexit was a big concern in 2012 because there was large fears of financial contagion, spillover to European banks, financial markets. It wasn't clear what would happen to the banking system. You had 3 years for everybody to get out, and anybody that wanted to get out, they're out. There was not going to be any contagion. There was not going to be any spillover. There was not going to be a financial crisis. And once you realize that, and you say, you're going to destroy your own country. If you think 25% drop in GDP is a lot, you got 75% more to go. You can look like Zimbabwe. Keep going. And I think the view was go ahead and Brexit. Go ahead and leave. Start this all over. I don't think this medium-term growth was coming. It takes, this endogenous response actually takes a fair bit of time. This is not something that's going to pop up in 12 months or 14 months. So I think in that sense, the hardcore view was go ahead and leave. You're going to set an example for all the rest of the southern periphery economies to stay in and do what they're supposed to. We'll make you the example. And I think that was when they finally realized they were not going to get in. They were going to let Greece be the example to the rest of the EU to abide by the rules and behave. And selling all the land, he left. There it is. That's privatization. That's the stuff Rudy was talking about before. Basically sell off these kind of assets. Whether it works or not, we'll see. You can sell off inefficient, low-performing, bad state assets and turn them over to a better firm. You can actually get a lot of productivity out of that. And that's, I think, more what the critical thing is. In addition to things Rudy mentioned, there were a lot of other things that have to be done in Greece. When you think that pension cuts, higher retirement age, you don't get retired at 55. Collective bargaining on wages for civil servants, which are 50% of the labor force. These things have to be done. Plus opening up, one of the big things is a lot of anti-competitive stuff. They
Open up trades, right? I mean, you can't buy cap lines, it's like hugely regulated.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most outrageous things they point out was that, for example, in Greece, I read this, all kind of drugs, everything that's over the counter, aspirin and everything, this has to be bought at a pharmacy in Greece. And you're only allowed to own one pharmacy. And there can only be one pharmacist in each pharmacy. And you can't buy unless there's a pharmacist in the pharmacy. What? Now imagine if you're Walgreens or CVS and you come in, guess what's all medical prices in Greece are about 30% higher
than the rest of Europe. This is Rudy's point.
Well, to be fair, Germany has that rule too.
Yeah.
So we should be telling the Greeks about that one.
Yeah, I mean, just
Doesn't make it better though.
I mean,
Doesn't make it
this
better.
is like productivity enhancing, driving prices down. This is what this stuff does. And people say, well, you'll drive these guys out of business. No, you won't. They still are going to use pharmacists. They may not need a pharmacy every 2 blocks, although sometimes with CVS and Walgreens, I think there are about every 2 blocks. But I mean, it's this kind of stuff that they're being told, you've got to get this kind of anti-competitive stuff out of your system if you want to continue to grow and have higher standards of living. You can't do these things and think you're going to grow. I'll stop there.
What a great panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for coming.